Здравствуйте, люди, это CossackHetman. Hello everybody, it's CossackHetman for part 2 of Kod Kozak video. In this video, we're going to be talking to you about the actual Kod Kozaks that we have written down and the modern day ones. Some of the evidential, tangible evidences that we really want to get our teeth into. So we'll start with the Bendery Constitution. So this occurred in 1710, shortly after Ivan Mazeppa died in exile. This is a very important figure in Cossack history. Definitely a figure that I'm going to be covering in this channel, so expect some videos on him later. But it's just important for context to know this. There's a lot of turmoil going on with the Cossacks and their proto-Cossack state, the CossackHetmanate, at this period of time, and there's lots of wars going on between Sweden, who they were allied with at the time, Muscovy, which other Cossacks were allied with in the time, and the Ottoman Empire, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was just a crazy mess up in this geographical region. So they really needed to create something that would legitimize the regions and lands that they held as being an actual state. So this is thus where the Bendery Constitution comes into play, and it's called the Bendery Constitution colloquially because it was written in Bender or Bendery in modern-day Romania when the Cossack hosts were in exile during this period of time. And it was written, like I said, 1710 by a newly elected hetman, Pilip Orlika, or Pilip Orlik in English. And it was actually, he wrote it in Latin originally, and the document is currently residing in Sweden, which is kind of interesting. Definitely a document I'd like to get my hands on one of these days, but I'll just put a photo of it for your interest. But the importance of this document cannot be understated, because it is one of the oldest democratic constitutions in Europe. And it established the separation of powers between the executive, which would be the hetman, the legislative, which would be the Council of Ottomans, and other commanders, and the judicial branches, as well as the religious sectors, all from each other, and giving them different powers and rights and all of this. And this is many years before Montesquieu and way before the American Constitution. It's not to say it's the very first democracy. Absolutely not. No, like constitution, like document. Because before this period, if you guys are well, I'll just tell you. Before this period, of course, we have the medieval period. So monarchies, governed by religious sectors, and then that devolves into feudalism, and then you have still monarchies, but empires at this regional empires. Some of them built on monarchies, others not. Regardless, none of them had democratic constitutions. And way before this time period, yes, you had democracies in ancient Greece and the ancient classical world, and those are direct democracies. And in the Roman period, of course, you can argue Justinian in Constantinople, but his laws that he came out with were exactly that. They were a set of laws and policies implemented and meant to be spread throughout the empire to allow individual democratic rights and freedoms to be upheld and protected, and where a lot of our modern day laws ultimately derive from, which is very interesting nonetheless. But nonetheless, it was not a constitution, one full-blown document covering the will of a people, giving, like I said, splitting all of these powers and giving them rights and freedoms to this group of people, the Kazakhs, and the areas that they controlled, and really establishing their will to independence and statehood. So yes, so this is really where the first Kod Kozak derives from, because off of this constitution, then all the colloquial and cultural customs derive themselves from the laws. So That would be the first Kod Kozak, would be the Bendery Constitution by Pilapaorlika. So out of this Bendery Constitution, we get to see some of the legal traditions and the cultural traditions of the Cossacks of this time period, the 1700s to 1800s. Out of this document, the parts that are still discernible or accessible to us are some of the death crimes that the Cossacks had on punishment, capital punishment. So, for example, here I'll just be reading some of them for you guys. Misappropriation of property, the excess of powers. So embezzlement of funds was considered to be one of the most dangerous crimes, since it hurt the community in general. Elders who exceeded their authority could be executed as well. So essentially, don't be stealing funds from the war chest, and don't abuse your position or your rank and position for your own personal gain. That could end your life. Theft is another huge one. Thefts were rare among Cossacks, since almost all property was in common use. But if it happened, the thief was killed, especially if the thief repeated the crime twice over. Lying and slander. Cossacks do not, what is it? I'm trying to translate it here. Cossacks do not uphold liars. One can be killed specifically for lies or slander about the current hetman. So, no telling lies, no slander. Drinking alcohol during a campaign. Now, this is pretty interesting. It kind of surprised me myself, because typically for this time period, especially the 1600s to mid 1700s, and arguably until modern day right now, the Cossacks are really known for being incredible drunkards. But however, here in the Constitution, Cossacks are to be punished with death sentence for breaking the dry law during a military campaign. So drink all you want at home and when you're not at war, but as soon as we're going to war, you gotta be sober. Which, that makes perfect amount of sense. Was this followed? We'll never know. Beating and murder. Murder is the most terrible crime against a Cossack. It will be punished by death. Severe punishment by beating and causing permanent injury. So if you're to murder one of your fellow brothers, you get beaten to crap, and if they decide not to kill you, then you just get crippled and maimed for the rest of your life. So very serious. Yeah, they took that very seriously until, like I mentioned in my previous video, a certain Cossack host deviated from this. And it's interesting that this law comes out during this time period when Cossack hosts were meeting each other on the battlefields at opposite sides. So I think it addressed something that obviously was really important, and like probably a focal point for them during this time period. And obviously, was this followed? But if it was violated, perhaps then these beatings and murder would take place. But did two wrongs make a right? That's not right. That's neither here nor there. We're just looking at the historical document. And then the last thing that we have from the Bendery Constitution that we can look up freely without having to go to Sweden ourselves is that the retired elders, so these would be like the retired atamans or hetmans that used to occupy the elective posts in this Rada, this assembly, they still had big sway and authority within the community. They played the important role of judges in the justice system, and they watched and maintained order within the community, and would pass judgment over these sorts of cases ultimately. So perhaps for some comically, perhaps having a group of senile old men passing judgment over you might be a little nerve-wracking. In other cases, perhaps it's the best, most wise idea to have your wisest and experienced members of the community passing judgment over you, whichever way you see it. Yeah, so that's the earliest legal traditions and kind of where the spirit of Kod Kozak really starts becoming documented and put into legalese, I guess, ultimately. Coming from, like I mentioned in the first video, like essentially the spiritual roots of Kod Kozak now are starting to become put into concrete written documents. So